I'm Jörgens, Business Development Manager of Hillebrand in Eastern Canada. I'm here to give everyone a little bit of an insight today about the world of freight forwarding, what we do, beverage logistics, and most importantly, of course, provide a little bit of context as to what the carbon footprint is of bringing wine or any beverage that we like from a vineyard or a distillery to our tables, parties, and events. And maybe even more importantly, what the industry is doing specifically to reduce that carbon footprint. Hillebrand was founded in 1844 on the banks of the Rhine River in Mainz, Germany, by a, at that time, young and ambitious entrepreneur called Johann Friedrich Hillebrand. So for those of you with quick math, indeed, this year we are celebrating our 175th year in business, which is obviously quite the milestone for us. So over the last 175 years, we have developed our expertise that today makes us the leading service provider in the forwarding of drinks and specialty products such as beer, wines, and spirits. It's this deep knowledge that allows us to bring our customers' products efficient to the global markets while having an understanding of how to maintain, and this is important, how to maintain the integrity of the product that the winemaker or beer brewer or master distiller has worked so hard to create. Now that's enough about Hillebrand. Let's get into the CO2 side of things. So this is today's landscape of greenhouse gas emissions. 25% is emitted by our sector, transportation. 25% by the generation of electricity and heat production. 21% by industry, 18% by buildings, and 11% of miscellaneous emitters. Now, within the transportation sector, you can see that road freight takes the lion's share of emissions, or generates a lion's share of emissions, which is fairly logical as they are by far the most common form of delivering products from A to B, as you can well imagine. Sea freight today only, and we'll see why I say only in a few slides, sea freight today only takes up about 3% of the greenhouse gas emissions emitted by our industry. The Kyoto Protocol focuses on the reduction reduction of the emission of 6 specific greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, sulfur hexafluoride, methane, perfluorocarbons, probably did not pronounce that properly, but nitrous oxide, and hydrofluorocarbons. Now, the ones in red, the 3 here, are the 3 that are emitted most, or that our sector, transportation, emits predominantly. And within those 3, it's obviously carbon dioxide that is by far the biggest gas emitted. However, today we're going to talk about a little bit about as well about the sulfur hexafluoride. The reason we talk about that is because the sulfur is also an air pollutant, and therefore is, aside from the global warming aspect of things, also a large factor contributing to the overall health of our planet. So global warming and the impact of sea freight. What is the impact of sea freight? We have to ask the questions, what do vessels run on? Vessels consume what is known as HFO, which stands for heavy fuel oil. HFO is a byproduct of refining other products, such as higher end products, such as gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, etc. And it's really kind of a tar molasses-like black liquid that it really looks like a residue. It's obviously therefore very cost effective, but it also packs a whole bunch of sulfur and other poisonous ingredients that once it is burned and released into the air, creates quite a bit of havoc, as you can imagine. In 2015, the world came together and 194, I believe, but 195 countries signed off on the Paris Agreement with the goal to limit the increase in the average global temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. So the European Commission issued a study a few years ago that which came to the conclusion that, although it says here could, it is actually most likely. It is most likely that sea freight, because of the growth in consumerism and in world population, as was described by some other speakers today, that it will be responsible for 17% of global CO2 emissions by the year 2050. So therefore, the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, and its Marine Environment Protection Committee have done some studies and have implemented some new regulations that govern all vessels worldwide in order to reduce the vessel or the ocean freight greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by the year 2050, compared to the greenhouse gases emitted in the year 2008, not to today, but back to 2008, 50% reduction by 2050, including the growth of ocean freight that will occur within that period of time. So it's obviously a very ambitious goal. Now, one of the most important ones is actually coming into effect in just a few short weeks on January 1st, which is wreaking havoc on the industry, I can tell you from this position right here. It's called IMO 2020. So IMO 2020. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases contribute to global warming, while air pollutants such as sulfur can be equally damaging to public health and to the environment. Previously, sulfur emissions were only controlled in the emission control areas in the world, which are the coasts of North America and some areas in Europe, including, for example, the English Channel. So IMO 2020 mandates that as of January 1st, that all fuels consumed in all waters globally by all vessels, no exceptions whatsoever, have a maximum sulfur content of 0.5%, which is down from what it is today, 3.5%. Health experts, and this is pretty incredible, health experts estimate that this switch will prevent roughly 150,000 premature deaths every year, and prevent 7.6 million childhood asthma cases globally every year. So that's a pretty staggering amount. Now, there are three ways that steamship lines can comply with IMO 2020 regulation, which again starts in a few short weeks. The first one is, fairly simply, buying low sulfur fuel. Now, there are two downsides with that option. The first one is that it's more expensive. It is a higher grade fuel, and therefore it takes longer to make, and therefore more expensive. And those costs are and will be passed down to the consumer eventually. The second way they can comply, which is slightly different, or actually very different, is they can continue burning heavy fuel oil. However, they need to install into their vessels what are called scrubbers. And scrubbers essentially capture the sulfur particulate matter directly from the exhaust system in the vessel. They scrub the particulate matter in waters, essentially waterlogging the particulates. And then that water that is supposed to be shipped offshore or onshore to be processed. Now, they quickly realized that the onshore capacity for processing this scrubbing water is nowhere near sufficient today. So the IMO, for the time being, has allowed steamship lines to scrub the water sulfur in ocean water, which is of course not ideal, but has been deemed to be far better than releasing them as particulate matters into the air. And the third option for steamship lines is to switch to LNG-powered vessels, which is also Hillebrand's corporate recommendation to our steamship line partners. Now, what is the impact of switching to LNG vessels on the globe? When we're talking about countering the greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming, 25 to 35% reduction in CO2 emissions, and almost in a complete elimination of any sulfur particulate matters, 99% reduction of any other particulate matters, and an 85% reduction in nitrogen oxides. So the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs has developed an index to help companies measure and report their environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions. And they've also made, within that study, an index. They've indexed the modes of transportation that we use globally. So as you can see here, according to this study, and it is actually of course the case, sea freight, deep sea sea freight, dry container is indexed at 100. So that is baseline greenhouse gas emitting, by far the most efficient or the most environmentally, if you could say that, conscious way of shipping goods from A to B. At 130 on the index is a deep sea ocean freight reefer container. Now, a reefer container is a container that is insulated and has a heating and cooling unit on it that allows cargo to travel from their origin to destination at a particular temperature range or at a set temperature. For example, wine typically is shipped at 15 degrees Celsius. So that comes in at about an index of 130, so 30% more emissions than the baseline index of 100. Intermodal rail, which is quite predominant, of course, in North America, is when you see those double stack containers come by on rail cars. Per ton or per kilo, whatever, per container, 4.8 times more emissions than ocean sea freight. Coastal at 531. Roll-off, roll-on vessels, which are vessels where trucks drive right on and right off, kind of large ferries, essentially, 746. Road, indexed at 11 times more polluting than ocean freight to get goods from A to B. So that's why you saw the 19% earlier. And of course, the nightmare that is air freight, which is always to be avoided at all costs, except for very last-minute shipments at an index of 17,000 and 28,000, respectively. Now, what are some of the factors for the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions in transportation, other than distance and weight of the cargo, of course, is also the type of fuel used. So there's a couple of concepts on this page here. One of them is, first of all, CO2E, which stands for CO2 equivalent. So the carbon dioxide equivalent is a standard unit for measuring carbon footprints, and the idea is to express the impact of each different greenhouse gas in terms of the amount of CO2 that would create the same amount of warming. So the other two concepts here are tank to wheel and well to wheel. So tank to wheel, what this means is literally from, so these are the four different types of fuel listed here. So literally heavy fuel oil from the gas tank through the combustion process of the engine to wheels or a boat propeller or a airplane engine. How many kilogram of CO2 equivalent is emitted per liter product used? So from tank through the engine to the wheels. Well to wheel is a different concept that takes into consideration the upstream CO2 emissions to create that fuel. So from the well, from the origin where it was either tar sands or directly from a well, through its production process and the distribution to wherever it needed to go to get into the tank of whatever unit it is fueling, boat, plane, train, automobile. So you can see that on a tank-to-wheel basis, in fact, heavy fuel oil, as I mentioned before, is the most polluting way of fueling a vessel. Much better, or better, an improved fuel source would be marine diesel oil, which is another word for low-sulfur diesel. And then you have the two more expensive, which are not economically viable for ocean freight, but of course, higher-end products that all contribute less than heavy fuel oil. However, when you take into the consideration the upstream impact of CO2, of the distribution and production of the product, you can see that heavy fuel oil comes in at a total of 3.31, but that the supposedly cleaner marine diesel oil comes in slightly higher at 3.53. So that's a little bit into contrast with what IMO 2020 mandates as of January 1st. when they will be switching to marine diesel oil, but it was deemed that the sulfate particulates in the air were so damaging to the environment and to people that the long-term greenhouse gas emission slight increase, came in second priority to the reducing of the sulfate particulate matter reduction. So, Hillebrand has worked with one of our partner NGOs to develop a tool to calculate CO2 emissions for door-to-door transportation moves. So here's an example. So when we applied this to a real-life move, in this case what we did is we calculated the CO2 emissions on one 20-foot container with wine from the Barossa Valley to Montreal via the port of Valencia. So from the door, from the vineyard, through the port of Adelaide, ocean, Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean, transshipped at the port of Valencia, and then onwards to Montreal, through the port to deliver to this building. A typical 20-foot container loaded with wine contains about 9,900 liters of wine, which is, in this case, bottled case good wine. From door to door, our tool estimates that 4,585 kilogram of CO2e is emitted into the atmosphere. That equates to close to half a liter of half a kilo of CO2e per liter of wine consumed. Now, if we look at reefer container, again, that's the container that has the air conditioning heating unit in it. It can take slightly less wine because it has thicker walls, so less cargo space for wine to go in. Emits close to 6,000 kilogram of CO2e, and which equates to 0.8 of a kilogram of CO2e per liter of wine. Now, another form of transportation that Hillebrand, and mind you, all of our competitors offer as well, is FlexiTank. FlexiTank is where we convert a 20-foot container into a bulk container by essentially, very simply explained, installing a 24,000 liter plastic bag. So this bulk wine, this container weighs more than, the product of it weighs more than a container of cased goods. So it will emit more CO2e for the exact same shipment. However, because of the pure quantity of product in the container, you can see a pretty severe reduction of CO2 expended for this exact same route. An ISO tank, which is a similar form of transportation, slightly higher because it's a steel tank, which then needs to be cleaned and repositioned for the next job, but focus here on FlexiTank. So, of course, with the FlexiTank, there are some downstream considerations to add on to the analysis, as, of course, we have to bottle the product and redistribute to the different distribution centers. So it's not a pure analysis, but from the perspective of transportation, FlexiTank is by far the most efficient way forward. Now, Australia is a good example. I believe at this point 65% of Australian wine currently leaves in this format, in the FlexiTank format, so and bottled at destination. And it used to be that bulk wine was the lower end product, but nowadays you can see not the high end, but of course some more mid-range manufacturers choosing this option and bottling in the country of consumption. Now, as I mentioned before, the industry is aiming to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050, which means that by 2025, we need to have reached already a reduction of 22% globally. So what does that look like in real terms? So today, that same shipment from Australia to Montreal emits 4,500 kilograms of CO2e, which, by the way, when you compare it to the amount of CO2e emitted by a car, that is a round trip from Montreal to Toronto for an average North American vehicle. In order to be on track to meet our targets by 2050, we can only emit by 5 short years from now 3,453 kilogram of CO2e per container, which is the equivalent of a single trip Montreal to Philadelphia in that same car. What are the Hillebrand initiatives to reducing or reaching that goal? First and foremost, we have signed up and are very active participants in an organization, a B2B collaboration held by an NGO called Business for Social Responsibility. They are known for the calculation of emissions at sea. There are 50 member companies, and between the 50 of us, we represent 80% of the world's container capacity. So it's a very influential and impactful organization. We've also signed up to the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. This is a voluntary initiative based on CEO commitments to 10 principles in the area of environment, labor, human rights, and anti-corruption. There are currently 13,000 corporate participants in over 170 countries. And last but not least, and some of you in this room might be familiar with the Kyoto Protocol. It actually started as a wine industry initiative, which is now open up to all global industries, which is a binding commitment to, by signatories from whichever sector to make a greater contribution to mitigating climate change. Now, last but not least, and I think, in fact, the most important way that Hillebrand is helping move towards our 2025 and 2050 goal of reducing greenhouse emissions in our sector. With the tool that we've developed with our partners, our customers can monitor carbon emissions with a complete overview of emissions associated to shipments while in transit during each stage of the journey. So they can see, okay, my container from Barossa went on a truck and then through a port and then onto a vessel and then another port and another truck and then a warehouse and then another truck. They can see in each step, as long as we control it, they can see on each step of the way how much CO2 is emitted for that particular shipment. So we as freight forwarders, we don't own the equipment, it's very hard for us to partake in ensuring that we move towards more sustainable fuel sources for these vessels, that we invest and do research and development in more cost-effective trucks or warehouses or whatnot. But what we do believe is that if you cannot manage the information, if you cannot measure your problem, you cannot manage your problem. So by providing our partners with key emission data and, where possible, alternative routes and greener options, and when I say greener options, I really mean greener options. There's a plethora of options out there, for example, for French wines, where currently we pick up a container at the port of Marseille or Le Havre. We drive that container all the way inland to the Loire Valley or to the Rhone Valley or any of those places and load up the container and drive it all the way back. As you've seen from my analysis, the road transport emissions of CO2 is 11 times more than ocean freight or typical ocean freight. So an example there is a relatively good barge system in France. So what we try to do with our, specifically our purchasers, such as the SAQ or any importer in North America or globally, is try to work with them to look at their lead time analysis. So 99% of the time, a container needs to be in Montreal at that day because I have a promotion at that event or this event or whatever. We try to work with them with using our tools to come up with a lead time analysis where we can allow the shippers or the importers to have a visibility as to how much further in advance they need to order in order to use the greener options that we have as options for them. So through these alternative routes and greener options, it is our ambition to guide the industry as a whole to a more sustainable supply chain and doing our part to reduce the global output of greenhouse gas emissions and help keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. That's it. Any questions?
Hi. I assume that the LCBO and the SAQ are two of your biggest customers in terms of transporting wine.
Yes, actually, they are my two biggest customers, being the business development manager of Eastern Canada, as well as the maritime liquor boards. The Eastern Canadian liquor boards are in charge, essentially take charge of the entire transportation of all their products that are on the shelves. So both have regulation in place where they essentially they are not actually allowed to buy a French wine from a warehouse in Montreal. They have to pick it up in France. They won't buy Scotch at a warehouse in Halifax. They have to pick it up in Glasgow. So yes, they control the entire supply chain on their behalf of their constituents. Yeah.
So did they ever request of you greener solutions?
You would hope so.
But they haven't yet.
They, in fact, they're both going through contract renewals now, which is an interesting process in and of itself. But both of them ask for, in an appendix, what we can do to make our options greener, and we attach, our initiatives and our ideas. But on a day-to-day, I'd say that transit time and getting the product on time, still today for them is a priority over greener options.
Okay, thanks.
Look, another question. Here? Sorry.
Oh, there. Here.
Sorry. Well, it was an obvious fact that you guys are one of the most important players in what we do, like transport the goods from one continent to another. And could there be any way for you to not impose, but strongly suggest a change in methods through different costing structure? Let's say if you're the SAQ and you're in a rush to get the wine in Montreal, by that time it will be slightly more expensive than if you take that route, and make the route more cost conscious for everyone, and ultimately for probably the supplier and the winemaker and the consumer. But all that put together, would that be a possible scheme of costing?
Extremely good question. And impose, no. We, at the end of the day, we're a service provider, and we have to work with what the priorities are of whatever our customer wants, right? So it's hard for us to impose something. But I would say, like I mentioned before, is that we take the liberty, it would take the time to, in fact, when a customer orders transportation with us, we show him many things. One thing is VIN routes, which shows, okay, your cargo is going to go from Beaune in France through the port of Le Havre to Montreal. We actually show them what the temperature range is that their product's going to go through, most likely. So it's from plus 30 in summer to a minimum of minus 25, and we advise them based on that, the transportation mode, saying, okay, we don't think you should do this in a dry container, you should do this in a reefer container, or you should insulate your container. So that's one. The other tool is we show them their greenhouse gas emissions. And by doing that, slowly we've been trying to show our customers that if you use this routing, you'll spend 4,500 kilogram of CO2e. But if you opt for the greener barge option at origin transport from let's say the Beaune area to the port of Marseille, it's a different routing. It takes a week longer, but hey, you're going to save yourself about 500, 600, 700 kilogram of CO2e. So that's how we're approaching it. Again, because we can't impose, but we can advise.
But it's mainly goodwill you're relying upon.
Yes.
Whereas it's collective cost that everyone's paying. Like it's a collective cost of having this good transported that fast, and actually no one is paying it. I'm not like judging, but I'm pretty sure there must be a way for you to like make the collective cost more expensive for someone at the base.
Yeah, no, I personally agree with you. Unfortunately, the reality is the market is that is not possible for us to really make that switch at this point.
Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick question. If the SAQ were to use the green option, how, en français, combien de temps, en fait, ce serait quoi les délais de transport? For right now, France to Montreal is about a month and a half to 2 months. So the SAQ would have to plan ahead, much ahead.
So today, the transportation from, let's say, again, from Beaune to Montreal, I would say is about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's not that long. So the actual vessel takes only 9 days. So by the time you load up your container, it's about a week to go through the loading and through the port process of the supply chain, and then 9 days to Montreal. It's pretty quick. I'd say that a green option would add about a week.
Okay.
Week or 2 weeks. But it depends, that's that particular example, right? If you're talking about Barossa Valley, Australia, that could add 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It really depends on what the greener option is, what the original routing was. Yeah, it really depends on those two factors, what the added time is. But it is not that much.
Great, thanks.
We've talked more about, I'm over here up on the other side.
There you go.
We've talked about options that are not necessarily that easy already, but it seems a bit like low-hanging fruit, like changing fuels. But what you're saying with the numbers, we need to get a lot further. How realistic and how much work is that to cut, say, from 25 to 50%?
I think that another really good question, and of course I'm not the steamship line, I'm not the specialist, but what I know of it is that what I've seen in the industry, and I go to events, I've spoken to some of the leaders of the bigger steamship lines around the world, is that their intention is definitely to move to the LNG ships. Now, those are switching out an engine on a vessel is expensive, really expensive. In fact, almost impossible, because you almost have to break the ship in two to take the engine out and put it back together. So the current fleet, today's fleet runs on heavy fuel oil, so and regular diesel oils. So it's going to take some time for steamship lines to get the funding and the capital expenditures together to go in that direction. I think 2050, the greenhouse gas emission reduction is fairly realistic. So let's say a typical lifetime of a container ship is about 25 to 30 years, I'd say. So if the half the fleet is about halfway into that period, the other half is relatively new. So we expect to see that in the next 2 to 3 decades, that the entire fleet of the world's fleet of container ships will have gone over to the LNG fuel source. Of course, the other area where transportation really needs to look very closely at themselves is, of course, road transportation, as it is still the biggest delivery method of cargo. There's less advancements, in my view, in terms of what they can burn, except for, of course, exciting technologies such as the Tesla truck and other. Mercedes-Benz also has some testing going on with battery-powered trucks. So I don't know what the timeline on that is. But I definitely say that it's crunch time for the transportation industry. It's going to be tight. But what I can say is that I'm seeing a lot of goodwill and a lot of effort going, and a lot of money spent going into trying to wean ourselves off of this heavy fuel based industry.
Question here.
I just want to go back to your first slide, which is how much carbon is in a liter of wine.
Yeah.
So if on either the first or the second option, it's about let's say 150 kilograms. That's based on 10,000 liters. So if the price of carbon is $50, we'll say, for all intents and purposes, so we're talking about like a penny a bottle, if I follow the logic correctly.
So what's the cost of, what did you say the cost was?
I mean, the carbon market is all over the place, but if we were to say $50, which is kind of the amount that's been thrown around.
So in my analysis, it shows that with the baseline transportation mode, ocean freight, it's about 46. It's close to half a kilo of CO2e for one bottle. Yes. So whatever the price of carbon is, if that's
per ton. So it's per metric ton, it's $50.
Yeah. So we're talking about essentially.
Less than a penny.
Yeah, we're talking about not a lot of money, indeed. Yeah.
Question right here in the middle. With studies of Bill Gates and TerraPower, is it ever going to be a possibility of having nuclear boats shipping worldwide?
I saw that documentary actually just the other day. Funny, thankfully. I don't know anything about that really. I'd say that, let me rephrase that, I'm not an expert. I'd say that I've read about it, and there are already military vessels that run on nuclear. So if they can make it a little bit more sustainable, if they can reuse, in that documentary, if they can reuse previously spent uranium rods, I'd say that yes, that would be an avenue that the ocean freight world could look at for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just following up to the question behind me, I know there's a few importers in the room and they might not be happy with this, but as consumers, what is our avenue, our power to put pressure on LCBOs and SAQs of this world to use the greener routes?
Best question of the day, in my mind, tell them. Because there's not their priority. Their priority is if you, and by the way, they're good people and they're gonna get there, but without them hearing from you guys, they're not gonna change anything too quickly. You have to tell them this is a priority for me. I'm okay with paying an extra 10 cents a liter to take the greener option. Because their mandates, if you look at their mandates as government institutions, it's very much getting the product on time, at the best cost, at the best time for our consumers. So that's very often in conflict with choosing a greener option, for sure. But whether that's the LCB SAQ or your local store or whatever it is, right? Okay. Thank you.